Yeah, welcome. This is now our third lecture in this macroeconomics course. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the objectives of macroeconomic policy. Last week, I introduced two main models of macroeconomics, the Keynesian model and the classical model. And of course, to some of you, this might have been familiar. I think what matters in this course is to contrast these two models to show how different their design is and how the design impacts on the implications of these models, and also to show you how different these two models are and how difficult it is to combine these models, what some economists do, the so-called neoclassical synthesis, but we'll talk about this later on. Today, we talk about the financial system and the role of banks. And again, we show this within the framework of these two different models, because I think here in this specific topic, banks, financial system, it will become very, very clear how different the roles of banks and financial markets are. And that it's also almost impossible to combine these two models as far as financial markets and banks are concerned. Okay, as always, this lecture is recorded, and we reserve the right to use and publish the videos for further future purposes. And if you take part in the lecture by using video or audio, you agree to this. Wonderful. So let's start. Again, we begin with the classical model, and as the picture shows you, this is really a model not for a monetary economy, it's a model for a corn economy or wheat economy. And this becomes very obvious when we discuss now the role of banks, of the financial markets in this very specific model. So when you attend a normal course on macroeconomics all over the world, then very often the professor will show you a chart, as you can see it here. This is a chart from the textbook of Michigan, one of the widely used US textbooks. And so you are now a student of economics. You want to know, how does the financial markets work? How does the financial system work? And of course, this is of enormous interest because you all experienced, maybe you are a little bit too young for experiencing it in too much detail, but there was this huge financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And so we all know that the role of markets and central banks is very important in the economy. And so you come to your macroeconomics course, and then the professor shows you this chart. And what can you see in this chart? Well, there is a flow of funds, and this flow of funds goes from savers to borrowers. So talked about this already last week. The source of funds in the classical model are the savers, of all the households, and in the classical model, households generate funds simply by not consuming the all-purpose good, because this releases the all-purpose good. For the financial markets, the households can now supply the all-purpose good on the financial markets, and then the investors can demand the all-purpose good. And what matters in this context is something that I've mentioned already several times. What matters is the ability of this consumption good to be used in all kind of different purposes. The households use it as a consumption good, and if they do not consume it and supply it, lend it on the capital market, then the all-purpose good changes its character, and instead of being a consumption good, it becomes now capital. And if the investors now borrow the all-purpose good for investment, then the all-purpose good changes its character again, and it becomes an investment good. And as I said, this is the specific design feature of the classical model. so that you can use one good in all these different functions. And so the financial flow starts with the lender savers, and then the funds can flow directly to the banks. The banks take these funds, the all-purpose good, as deposits. And in the next step, the banks use the all-purpose good and supply it as loans, so to say, funds for the investors. So this is the one-way flow going from the savers via banks to the investors. And what matters, once the all-purpose good, the funds arrive at the investors, they are used up. They can no longer be used for different purposes, because now the all-purpose good has changed its character from a financial asset into a real asset investment, and the investors plant the all-purpose good as an investment good. If you look at this chart, so you have this one-way flow, and this one-way flow can also go over another intermediate institution, the financial markets. And financial markets mean that the savers supply by themselves the all-purpose good on the financial markets, and the investors come to the financial market and borrow this all-purpose good from the savers. So that's why in these textbooks they differentiate between direct finance, where the suppliers and demanders of funds meet directly at the market, or indirect finance, where the households, savers, and investors use banks as intermediaries. But overall, it's this one-way flow that characterizes the financial system in these textbook presentations. And while it is very simple, that's a positive thing, I would say it has very little to do with the reality of sophisticated financial systems in the 21st century. So it's amazing, in my view, that in so many textbooks you still find this kind of presentation. And when we go ahead in this lecture, and when we see the financial system as it is presented in the monetary model, we'll see it's much more complicated. This is true, but it's also much more realistic. So yes, the picture here shows this one-way flow from savers to borrowers, and more or less all the points here have already been raised. Classical model: funds are created by the households who decide to save. Banks and the capital market are mere intermediaries for funds. And what is important for this model, banks are not different from other intermediaries or from the capital market. The only thing is to serve as a conduit for the flow of the all-purpose good from savers to investors. And as I said, the interesting thing is this flow comes to an end whenever the all-purpose good comes to the investors, who use it then as an investment good. And this role of the banks, the classical model, is something that you find in almost all standard textbooks. For instance, the very interesting and intriguing textbook by Acemoglu and others says to banks, banks are only one of many types of financial intermediaries. It says many different types of financial institutions act as financial intermediaries, channeling funds from suppliers of financial capital, in other words, savers, to the users of financial capital. Here you see very nicely that this all-purpose good, which is something that the households can consume and which the investors can invest, is here now labeled as financial capital. So you can see this changing nature of the all-purpose good, which is something which has very little to do with reality. Because when you have a television set and you don't want to consume it, it's very difficult to use it as financial capital, which you can supply on the capital market, which then can be borrowed by investors who use it as investment goods. So you can see that this presentation of the financial system is extremely unrealistic. Nevertheless, that's what normally students learn when they come to a class on macroeconomics. And it's amazing, in my view, that this presentation is not much more criticized, and it's still accepted as a model of reality. As I said, in this model, banks are not different fundamentally from financial market. And it's interesting that in some model presentations, banks are not a positive feature, an institution that has a positive contribution to the economic process. Instead, banks are often presented as a friction. So there is this flow of funds from the savers to the investors, and if it goes via banks, something gets lost, because banks want a compensation for their role as intermediary, and so the flow that starts from the savers does not arrive 100% at the investors. Something is taken away from the banks just as a compensation for their intermediation role. And that's why, astonishingly, banks are often described as a friction in the financial system. And here you see a chart from a paper by Michael Woodford, a paper which wants to show the role of financial crisis in a relatively simple model. And on the right side, you can see our familiar saving and investment diagram from the classical model. Woodford does not present it as saving or investment. He says it's a supply of loans and demand for loans, but you could also say it's a supply of funds, which is then saving. And so you can hear this is identical to saving, and this is identical to investment. So we still have our familiar chart. And now, if this process of combining saving and investment is now intermediated by banks, then you have a situation where the savers get a lower interest rate than the borrowers. So this is the interest rate for the savers, and this is the interest rate for the borrowers. And the difference is the spread that has to be paid to the banks for performing their role as a financial intermediary. So quite interesting. Banks are not an institution making economic processes easier, making more funds available for investment. In the classical model, banks are simply a friction. Okay. So we have banks and other intermediaries in this model. We have this one-way flow, and the question that rises immediately is, if you have banks, funds, and financial market, what is the role of money in this classical model? Why do we need money? And this question rises if you look in standard macroeconomic textbooks, when they describe the role of prices and the price level. So in the macroeconomics textbook by Barrow, he starts saying, okay, we assume there's a single type of good which can be used for consumption or investment. Exactly what we say the all-purpose good. Then he says the goods market is a place in which households exchange goods for money, exchange the all-purpose good for money. Then he says the price in this market, denoted P, expresses the number of dollars that exchange for 1 unit of goods. We call P the price level. And now let's think of it a little bit. Let's think of the design of this model. Have only one good. How can I exchange this good? For what can I exchange this good? Well, the only way the good can be exchanged is in the temporal trade, because in intra-temporal trade, if there's only this one good, how can I exchange it into another good if no other good is available? So the only trade is intertemporal trade. And therefore, the only price that we have described so far in this model is the interest rate, the price for this intertemporal trade. So the question is, what is the role of money in this model? So money in the reality is of course an important function. It's a wonderful means of exchange, because when people normally purchase goods, there is no double coincidence of wants. So there's in the older literature an example of the hungry baker. There's an example of the hungry tailor waiting for the baker that needs a new pair of trousers. So this is a double coincidence of wants. So if there's no money, of course, it's difficult to find somebody who wants to purchase the good that you can offer against the good that you want to buy today. So that's the problem of this double coincidence of wants. And without money, it's very difficult, because then you are in a barter economy and maybe you need a lot of indirect exchanges until you finally get the commodity that you want. So the economy without money is an economy with very high transaction costs. That's why money is a wonderful means of exchange. And sometimes in countries with hyperinflation, if the national currency is no longer accepted as a means of payment, this creates a lot of problems. So money is useful as a means of exchange in intra-temporal trade. But if we have no intra-temporal trade, because we have only one commodity, why do we need money? It's not clear. And so money is useless. And if there's only one good, what is the role of the price and the price level? Prices in the reality of our economies are, of course, important as a numeraire to compare the prices of different goods. So if you compare the price of trousers with the price of a glass of beer, you can just do it because they are both expressed in euros or dollars. But without prices as a numeraire, it's difficult, because then you have to ask how many glasses of beer is one pair of trousers, and how many kilo of apples are one glass of beer, and so on and so on. So without prices as a numeraire in an economy where you have many goods, it's very difficult to compare the prices of different goods. And therefore, the price expressed in euro or in dollar is a very useful device for reducing the information costs in the economy. But if you have only one good, what do I need the price for? There's no other good where I could have at least a relative price, and where I could compare the price of one good with the price of another good. So there's the same thing as with money. In the world of the all-purpose good, there's no role for prices. And if there's no role for prices, there's also no role for the price level, because the price level shows us how a basket of goods, how the prices of a basket of goods change over time, and this allows us to measure inflation. But if you have only one good, again, it does not make sense to have a price level. So the main problem of this classical model is we do not need money, we do not need prices. They are absolutely useless. But this is now a challenge for this theory, because there is money in reality, there are prices in reality. And how can you deal with this problem? Well, the classical theory uses a simple trick. They say, well, money falls from heaven, and once we have money, we can also express the all-purpose good in monetary terms. So you can say, okay, if we have 5 units of the all-purpose good, and then we can arbitrarily give a money price to this all-purpose good. So if the money price of the all-purpose good is €5, you have 5 units of the all-purpose good, then these 5 units of the all-purpose good cost €25. But it's of course useless. It's just a veil within you wrap the real side of the economy, but it's completely artificial. You don't need it. But nevertheless, classical theorists also want to say something on inflation and money and on prices. And so you need a trick. How can you get money into this model? There's no role for the central bank, no role for banks. We only have the all-purpose good. So, well, you need a trick. But before we come to the trick, let's just repeat it again a little bit. So, in the classical models, bank needs to collect the all-purpose good from households for giving a loan. As banks and the central bank are unable to create the all-purpose good, they have no impact on saving, which is the supply of the all-purpose good, and investment, which is a demand for the all-purpose good. And as saving and investment determine the real interest rate, banks and the central bank cannot control the interest rate. I think that's extremely important. The real interest rate in this model is only determined by real factors, and banks and central bank have no impact on this real interest rate. And with only one good and only intertemporal trade, there is no role for prices and the price level. And the trick now is a trick of helicopter money, which money is supplied in this classical world, which in principle does not need money. And as I said, this theory only describes the monetary veil, which means there's an irrelevant price level which cannot affect the real sphere. And the neutrality of money, which is main feature of the classical model, is just a result of this kind of modeling. So, can you believe that money falls from heaven? Helicopter money? I think most of us would be happy if money falls from heaven. We would appreciate that. But so far, we have not experienced this. And so let's talk about this helicopter money. And the inventor of helicopter money is Milton Friedman, one of the key figures of monetarism, monetary theory. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize for his theories and his research on money. And so what does he write? He said, well, let us suppose now that one day a helicopter flies over this community, drops an additional $1,000 in bills from the sky, which is of course hastily collected by the members of the community. So money falls from heaven, people collect it. And this is the money supply process in this model, which has not so much to do with reality. That's the only way how in this model you can describe, or you can imagine something as the money supply process. So, and then he goes on, let us suppose that everyone is convinced that this is a unique event which will never be repeated. And then suppose further that each individual happens to pick up an amount of money equal to the amount held before. And then he says, well, the final equilibrium must be a nominal income of $20,000 instead of $10,000 with precisely the same flow of real services as before. So it's just a doubling of the price level. If you double the money stock, you just double the price level. You need this kind of unrealistic money supply process in order somehow to introduce money and prices in the classical model, but one must be very clear from the very logic of the classical model. There is no role for money, no role for the price level, and all that is added to this model with this helicopter money approach is an artificial trick which does not really fit with the logic of this model. So we can then describe the role of the central bank in this model. So the idea is the central bank can control the money stock. It is not so precise about what kind of money is concerned in this approach, but the helicopter money is obviously cash. And the key equation in the classical model is a so-called quantity equation. M times V is P times Y. And this theory assumes there is a relationship between the money stock M, the velocity of money, which we have on the left side of the equation, and the price level and real output on the other side of the equation. Now what this theory assumes, it assumes that the velocity of money is constant and that output is also constant, which fits with a classical theory, which is a kind of stationary theory with a given amount of output. And with stable velocity and stable output, there's a very simple relationship between the money stock and the price level. So whenever the money stock increases, the price level also increases, and if the money stock doubles, the price level also doubles. So this is the main equation of the classical theory for the monetary side of the economy. But as I said, it's all kind of artificial because all these processes have no impact on the real side of the economy. They have no impact on saving, on investment. They have no impact on the real interest rate. So it's kind of artificial framework that is built around the real core of the economy. And of course, this is a logical consequence of this classical theory where all that matters is real. And the whole financial sphere is this kind of veil which one can describe, which one can show, but which has no impact on the real economy. And that's also what is people have in mind when they talk about the neutrality of money. Money is neutral, has no effect, or is this kind of veil. And so with this merely artificial role, so to say, of the central bank, which cannot affect any of the real relationships in the economy, the real role, so to say, of the central bank in the classical model is extremely limited. And this is nicely described in a paper by Ricardo Reis in the Oxford Handbook of the Economics of Central Banking, who says, either way, the central bank is not all that different from the parking tickets office. You know, the parking, pay your parking, or the issuer of permits for both. It collects the revenue and uses it to provide direct fiscal transfers that lower the fiscal burden of the government. Yeah, and that fits into the logic of the classical model. Central bank can do all kinds of magical things with the price level, with the nominal sphere, so to say, of the economy, but it doesn't matter. As far as the real sphere is concerned, the classical model, central bank is not that different from parking tickets office or the issuer of permits for both. Tiny little booth where the central bank sits selling parking tickets, collecting small fees. That's what the role of central banks is in the classical model. I find that quite fascinating. This is the handbook of the economics of central banking from the year 2019. Central bank has a parking tickets office. So this was a short presentation of the financial system in the classical model. And I would say before we continue with the monetary Keynesian model, we have a short break, 5 minutes, and then we meet again.
Okay, so before we start the Keynesian model, there's one more question. Regarding the theory of prices in the classical theory, does this mean that there's no theory of prices in the classical theory? Is that the case with having with the subjective theory of prices and models of price equity?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. It's very important to clarify this. We are talking here about macroeconomics and the classical macroeconomic theory. Of course, there's classical theory of microeconomics, and of course, prices there play an important role, and relative prices play an important role. So it's very important to clarify this. We are talking about macroeconomics, not about microeconomics. Of course, prices, relative prices, are essential for the classical macroeconomic theory. So thank you very much for this question. Good. Now let's continue with the monetary or the Keynesian model. Now the main difference is that funds, financial funds, in this model are not this all-purpose good. Funds are always money. And money can be defined relatively easily in this model. Money is always deposits with a commercial bank. We talk about sight deposits because you can, these deposits, you can always at short notice withdraw them from the bank or you can transfer them to another bank. So these are very liquid deposits, which we normally describe with the so-called money stock M1. Money stock M1 consists of cash in circulation plus these very liquid deposits with commercial banks. So whenever we talk about funds, the Keynesian model is always these very liquid assets, deposits with the commercial bank. And in fact, whenever you want to buy something today, you need these kind of funds. You need some money on your account with a commercial bank. Maybe you can also use some overdraft facilities. But whenever something is paid in our world, it's always a transfer of these funds from one bank account to another bank account. So this is a key difference in the design, in the modeling of the Keynesian model. And of course, this has extreme implications for the whole functioning, working of the financial system compared to the way how the financial system works in the classical model. So money is this money stock M1, very liquid assets, and it's important to not confuse the money stock M1 with the so-called monetary base, or which is also sometimes also called central bank money. And this money stock consists also of currency in circulation, but then the deposits in this monetary aggregate are deposits held by commercial banks with the central bank. You can also call these deposits reserves of the commercial banks. And if we see today a very strong increase of money stocks due to the activities of central banks financing governments. Of course, both aggregates increase, the money stock M1, but also the monetary base. But you can see on the chart on the right side that for the euro area, the increase of the monetary base was much stronger than the increase here of the money stock 3. The money stock 3 also increased quite a bit in the euro area, but the increase was much less than the increase of this monetary base. So it's very important to differentiate between these two monetary aggregates, but we'll talk about this in more detail when we discuss the monetary policy of the ECB and of other central banks. So then, in this Keynesian monetary model, financing always means that you provide somebody for a certain amount of time a liquid deposit to the commercial bank. This is financing. You lend a deposit to the commercial bank to somebody else, and this is what is called financing. And this financing can be done either by banks that provide loans or by private investors who have bank deposits and are willing to lend these bank deposits for a certain amount of time to somebody who is in need of bank deposits. So one can also say financing always means a provision of liquidity. I think that's what this temporary provision of liquid bank deposit means. And here you see here immediately that in this Keynesian monetary model, the main actor, the decisive actor, are the banks. Banks create, produce financial funds. And this is completely different than in the classical model, where the savers and private households are the key players who create the funds by not consuming. So you can really see how different these two approaches are. And we will also see that they lead to completely different implications for the functioning of the financial system. So this then leads to the question, where does the money, where do the funds come from? And as I said, the banks are the key actor in this Keynesian model. The classical model, banks are simply an intermediator of the all-purpose good, kind of wholesale dealer, you can say, for the all-purpose good, but they are simply a conduit where this flow of saving passes through, or can negatively, as we just saw, can also say it's a friction in this process of financing. And here in the Keynesian model, it's completely different. The banks originate money, they create money out of nothing. And of course, this gives them a very powerful role. The key difference is in the classical model, banks are just intermediating funds. They transmit the funds from savers to investors. In the Keynesian model, banks originate these funds. What a huge difference in the role of banks. And we can also see then that in this role, banks are specific, they are unique, they are not like other intermediaries. The classical model, all intermediaries transmit funds. In the Keynesian monetary model, banks create funds out of nothing. That makes them special, gives them a huge power. And of course, this power can also create a lot of problems and crises, as we shall see later on. So how can banks create money? Well, it's so simple. They can just create money if they give a loan to somebody who wants to buy something for which he doesn't have the money. So let us look at this example. We have Mr. Smith. He wants to buy a new laptop and he doesn't have the money. And so he goes to the bank and asks the bank for a loan of 1,000 euros. If the bank says yes, they give you the loan, then the money is created, because then the account of Mr. Smith is credited with 1,000 euros, and here is the money. The money is created simply by giving a loan. So in the monetary model, it's the loans that create the money. It's the loans that create the deposits. That's exactly the opposite of the classical model, where it is the deposits that create the loans. So in the classical model, the bank has to collect the all-purpose good, which you can then call deposits. And once the bank has collected the deposits, it can then now decide to give them as a loan to the investor. So in the classical model, it's the deposit that creates the loan. In the monetary model, it's the opposite. It's the loans that create the deposit. Here you can see how huge a difference is between the two models. It's just the opposite direction of causality. So it's not something minor. It's completely different in the mechanics. And of course, this also then has huge ramifications for the functioning of the whole financial system. So what you can then also say is that in this monetary model, the demand for money is identical with the demand for a loan. So if Mr. Smith needs 1,000 euros, he has a demand for 1,000 euros, it's identical with the demand for a loan. And if the bank gives the loan to Mr. Smith, it's identical with the fact that the bank gives 1,000 euros to Mr. Smith on his bank account, it supplies this amount of money to Mr. Smith. So the demand for loans is identical with the demand for money, and the supply of loans is identical with the supply of money. So in order to understand this a little bit better, we have to use the instrument of T accounts. Sometimes this is very helpful to describe economic processes, and we can do this relatively short. So the key idea is deposits do not create loans, loans create deposits. And we have already talked about it. So if the A bank gives a loan to Mr. Smith, Mr. Smith has on his bank account 1,000 euros, and on the balance sheet of the A bank, these 1,000 euros are on the liability side, and you can see the loan by the A bank is identical with the demand deposits with the A bank, and on the balance sheet of the A bank, it's just the opposite. So this is a very simple way how an individual bank creates money, creates loans. Does this mean then that the individual bank can create money loans without limit? Because that's what you might think if you see this. So you just write it on both sides of the balance sheet, so you can create money loans out of the blue. And the question is this really true? or is it not a little bit more complicated? And in fact, it's a little bit more complicated, as the whole presentation of the financial system in the Keynesian model is more complicated than in the classical model, because we have banks as an individual actor creating money. So the question is, what are the implications for the A bank? So we cannot just have the first step that A bank gives a loan to Mr. Smith, but of course Mr. Smith wants to do something with a loan, because just asking for a loan and then keeping the money on a bank deposit is not a good idea, because you have to pay a lot of interest, especially for consumer loans nowadays. And if you keep then the money without interest on as a deposit, it's not a very good choice. So obviously, Mr. Smith has some plans, and as I said, he wants to buy a laptop. And the question is now, if he pays the laptop, where is the account of the company that sells the laptop? And here we have different options. So the question is, how can he use the deposit that he has obtained with the loan? And I think in most cases, he makes a payment to an account with another bank, which we call B bank. There's also the possibility that he uses the money for a cash withdrawal and then pays the laptop in cash. And there's also, as the third option, the possibility that the company that sells the laptop has the same bank account as Mr. Smith at the A bank. So, and these three options for paying the laptop have different implications for our A bank. If the money is transferred to B bank, so if the company that sells the laptop has its account with the B bank, then we have a kind of interbank payment from A bank to B bank, and this payment is settled via the central bank. That's a little bit complicated. We'll describe it in more detail. But the effect of this payment via the central bank is that the reserves of the A bank with the central bank decline, while the reserves of the B bank with the central bank increase. So these payments between the two banks mean a shift of central bank reserves from one bank to another. And it implies for the A bank that after the payment is made, its reserves with the central bank have declined. So they imply a loss of reserves with the A bank. And it shows, obviously, there is some limitation, at least for the individual bank. But can create loans out of nothing if the money the bank A creates goes to bank B, it implies a loss of reserves for the A bank. So there are some limitations for the individual bank, not for the whole banking system, because this transfer from A bank to B bank shifts the reserves from one bank to another, but in aggregate for the whole banking system, the amount of reserves remains constant. So you can see why for the individual bank, there's a limitation due to the loss of reserves. For the whole banking system, these transfers from one bank to another just shift the reserves in the system, but they do not reduce it. So in this regard, the reserves are not a limitation for the banking system as a whole. If we have a look at the two other ways to pay for the laptop, if Mr. Smith decides to pay in cash, then it also implies a reduction of the central bank reserves of the A bank, because in order to get the cash, the A bank must use its central bank reserves, and if central bank gives cash to A bank, then of course the reserves of the A bank decline. So for A bank, it's more or less the same whether the payment is made via a bank transfer from A bank to B bank, or whether Mr. Smith withdraws the money in cash and then makes a payment to B bank. Then we have a final option. That's the easiest one for A bank. So if the seller of the laptop has an account also with A bank, then it's just a transfer from one account of A bank to another account of A bank, which means the reserves of A bank are not affected. But as now A bank, after the whole process of giving the loan and this payment, it has a higher amount of deposits, and the central banks have to hold minimum reserves on their deposits. A bank has to hold a higher amount of minimum reserves, which also means there is kind of additional demand for reserves. But in this case, it's relatively low because in the euro area, the minimum reserve ratio is just 1%. So this is not very important. Okay, so we have these implications. And as A and B are the most likely cases, it means whenever the individual bank provides a loan, creates money, the deposits flow out of the individual bank, it implies a reduction of the reserves of the A bank. Okay, so let's have a look at the balance sheets of A bank, central bank, B bank, the balance sheet of Mr. Smith and Mr. Miller, who sells the laptop. In the initial situation, A bank has reserves of 5,000, B bank has reserves of 5,000, and they are the liabilities side of the central bank. And we assume that the two banks obtain the reserves in the form of a refinancing loan by the central bank. So we have here 10,000, it's a refinancing to A bank and B bank. And you can see this on the liability side of A bank and B bank. Now we have this loan of €1,000 to Mr. Smith. And as we've already seen, it increases. Now balance sheet of Mr. Smith gets longer and the balance sheet of the B bank is longer. Okay, I think this is easy. Now we continue and ask what happens now with this bank transfer from Mr. Smith to Mr. Miller, who sells the laptop. And here now we see that the €1,000 that were created by the loan are now transferred to Mr. Miller. And Mr. Miller holds this deposit with B bank on the balance sheet of Mr. Smith. On the asset side, there's nothing left because he's just made the payment. On the liability side, he has his loan. And now the interesting thing is that for B bank, the additional €1,000 on its liability sides are reflected in higher reserves with the central bank, which are now 6,000. And for A bank, the implication is it has no longer the deposit by Mr. Smith, but now, as a consequence, its reserves are €1,000 lower. And we can now see nicely that this transfer shifts the reserves from A bank to B bank. You can also see in some, both banks together, we still have the same amount of reserves in the system. And now we see the constraint for individual banks in this monetary model. When they provide a loan, the most likely consequence is that when they give the loan, their amount of reserves decline. And if you assume that the €5,000 of reserves that the A bank was holding before it gave the loan is the amount of reserves A bank needs, then of course there is now a gap of reserves of €1,000. And so there's now for A bank a need to refill this reserve gap. There are two ways how this can be refilled. One way is that A bank goes to the central bank and the central bank provides additional refinancing loan of €1,000. Then the reserves of A bank go back to 5,000. Or the other option is that A bank now tries to borrow 1,000 euros from another bank. And in this model situation, it's relatively easy because you can see due to the payment, the reserves of B bank are now 1,000 euros higher than 1,000 euros higher than before. And if you assume that 5,000 euros was the optimum amount of reserves, then B bank might be willing to lend these 1,000 euros to A bank. This is what we have shown here in the fourth panel, and you can see now that B bank lends 1,000 euro to A bank, and we call this interbank loan or money market loan. And as a result, the reserves are now of both banks go back to 5,000 euro. So this is really important for the understanding of the money supply process in a monetary economy, that while banks can create loans out of nothing, for the individual bank, there's always a need to refill the reserve gap that is created if the money that it has created, the deposits that it has created, flow to another bank. In principle, the gap can be filled easily in the form of interbank loans or money market loans, because the reserves of the bank that receives a payment are increased, and in principle, this bank does not need these reserves, so it might in principle be willing to lend the reserves to another bank. So this is a kind of core principle of the money supply process, the loan supply process in a monetary economy. And this dependency of the individual bank on reserves after it has given a loan provides the lever with which the central bank can now control this whole process. There are some theorists who say, well, the central bank cannot control the money supply in a monetary economy, because the banks can create money out of nothing. So these people talk about endogenous money, where the central bank has lost all the control over the money supply. And I think without going into these details that you described here, one might easily get this impression, because in principle, yes, you can create loans. With loans, you create the deposits, and what limits this process? And in order to, and if this process is without any constraints, then of course it would be again a situation where the central bank cannot control the interest rate, where the central bank cannot control the real side of the economy. And that's what theorists say who propagate this theory of endogenous money. But as you can see here, it's not that easy. There is, for the individual bank, always the need to acquire additional reserves once it has given a loan. And this need to acquire additional reserves is now the way and the lever, as I said, with which the central bank can control this process, which in principle looks very independent and seems to be out of control of the central bank. So, as I said, for the individual bank, loan in most cases, the transactions A and B implies a reduction of its deposit with the central bank, so it has a kind of reserve gap. For the banking system in aggregate, transaction A implies a shift of reserves which remain constant in aggregate. So now, for the individual bank, all this implies whenever it gives a loan, it must refinance it somehow. And there are two ways how these loans, how the refinancing of loans, how the can be achieved, how the reserve gap can be closed. And this is one way is by lending from other banks, as we have seen, from interbank lending on the money market, or by lending directly from the central bank, which we call also central bank refinancing. What now is important, if the individual bank wants to lend money, liquidity, or reserves from either from the central bank or from other banks, it has to pay. Sorry, if an individual bank wants to borrow liquidity from the central bank or from other banks, it has to pay interest on this. And this interest is called money market rate if the bank borrows from other banks, or you can also call it the refinancing rate if the money is borrowed from the central bank. And this is now the instrument with which the central bank can control the lending of commercial banks. Because as a bank, I know if I give a loan, I have to refill the reserve gap by lending from the central bank or from other commercial banks, and I have to pay interest rate for this. So when I decide to give a loan, of course, I also have to decide what will be the interest rate for the loan, with the pricing for the loan. And this pricing for the loan is, of course, determined by the costs of refilling the reserve gap, either via the money market or via borrowing from the central bank. So by controlling now the interest rate for the refinancing or the money market rate, the central bank can have a very strong impact on the interest rate that banks charge on loans to private customers. So it's not about quantities. This control is a control about the prices for loans and the price for the refinancing that is required to fill the reserve gap if a bank gives loans. So this is, so to say, a little mystery of how central banks can control this process of the banks, which in principle can endogenously create money, but via this interest rate, there is a very effective control of commercial banks over the lending of commercial banks. And these two rates, the rates on the interbank, on the money market, or the rates for central bank refinancing, these interest rates are normally very close to each other. Today, there are some smaller discrepancies, but overall, they are more or less identical. How the central bank controls this interbank market is something which we will discuss in 4 or 5 weeks when we talk in more detail about the monetary policy of the ECB. But now let's just assume the central bank can control this short-term rate very directly, and via this control over the short-term interest rate, central banks have a relatively direct impact on the prices for loans that are given by commercial banks. And the interest rates that reflect this short-term lending between banks are interest rates that are widely observed also in the press every day. So for the United States, it's the so-called federal funds rate, and for the euro area, it's the ONIA rate. Both rates are rates for overnight lending. So if the commercial bank at the end of the day realizes its level of reserves is too low, it can lend from another commercial bank for 1 day central bank liquidity, and the interest rate for lending reserves, so to say, for 1 day is what is called overnight rate. And yes, in the United States, this overnight rate is the federal funds rate, and in the euro area, it's the ONIA rate, euro overnight interest rate, average rate. So it's also the rate for 1 day, and these rates are very widely observed. We can also more or less say they are the policy rates, the rates that the central banks target in order to control the process of the money supply. So, based on all this, we can derive a very simple model for the supply and the demand for bank loans. It looks, but all these charts look the same, whether it's for the classical model or whether it's for potatoes or for foreign exchange. So we have kind of standard model. But now we have the loan supply of funds. And what matters now, this supply of funds comes not from households, like in our classic model, it comes from banks. Banks who supply funds by providing loans. And this supply of funds, so to say, the supply of money via bank loans, depends, of course, on the interest rate for bank loans. The higher the interest rate that you get for loans, of course, the more banks are willing to provide loans. The interest rate on the money market, which reflects the refinancing costs. And here we have assumed the supply curve that banks only are willing to provide a loan if the interest rate they can charge is higher than the money market rate. So, of course, yeah, they want to make profits. And so we have this, and of course, what also important for the supply of bank loans is the perceived credit risk of loan. So we can have a very simple supply curve for bank loans, and then we can ask what is the demand for bank loans. And the demand for bank loans can come from private households for consumer loans, mortgages, can also speculate. Maybe some household has the idea that Bitcoin will go up to 100,000, and so it tries to lend as much as possible for the speculation. It can come from firms for investment, but what is important here, and I think that's also an important difference to the classical model. In this monetary model, the demand for funds does not only come for new investment. The demand for funds comes also for purchasing existing real assets, like houses, like firms in the kind of merger and acquisition process. So it is not, the demand for funds is not related to investment in the sense of new investment. It's a much broader demand, and of course, what also determines demand for loans are the governments that can also go to banks and can borrow from banks. So, and of course, the demand for bank loans is higher the lower the interest rate for loans, and of course it's lower if the interest rate for bank loans is higher. So we have a very simple demand and supply scheme, and the control of the central bank over the whole system can be described in a very simplified way. If one assumes that the central bank increases the refinancing rate or increases the money market rate, it means that for the individual bank, the costs of giving a loan increase. And so if a higher money market rate, higher refinancing rate shifts the supply curve upwards, and you can see as a result of this higher money market rate, the interest rate for bank loans goes up, the banks charge higher interest rates, and of course, the amount of bank loans that are given goes back. So it's a kind of price control over the money supply process, which is quite effective and also not so difficult. Maybe some of you have learned the so-called multiplier model of how banks give loans and of how the central bank can control the money supply and the credit supply. And this multiplier model is a model that describes the whole process simply in terms of quantity, not in terms of prices. Here, what matters, and I think that's what describes reality, are the interest rates for loans and the interest rates for the refinancing with which individual banks are confronted. In the multiplier model, there's the idea the central bank just increases the monetary base, and there's a multiplier which then translates into an increase of the amount of loans that banks are providing. So the multiplier model assumes that banks always have a lot of potential borrowers who are at the existing interest rate eager to borrow, but the banks cannot satisfy this demand. And whenever then the central bank throws monetary base to the commercial banks, then they say, oh wow, now we can satisfy the demand of our customers without any effect on the interest rate. And so the idea of the multiplier model is absolutely incompatible with reality, because normally it's not the case that at the prevailing interest rates, banks have a large amount of customers who would like to have a loan, but banks cannot give the loan because they do not have enough reserves. This is absolutely absurd. Yeah? But again, this is also something which you can find in all kinds of textbooks. It's very flawed because it's only about quantities, and it assumes a kind of disequilibrium on the market for the demand and supply of bank loans, which doesn't exist. So if you have heard about this multiplier model, if you have learned it, it's also one of the absurdities that you can find in textbooks. And again, also this is the monetary model. It's also flawed because it also has a wrong causality. It assumes when the central bank increases the amount of monetary base, then we get more bank loans at a constant interest rate. This model assumes if the central bank wants to have more bank loans, it has to reduce its refinancing rate, and this makes banks to lend more, and as a consequence, more reserves are needed. So it's just the opposite causality. So you find in these textbooks a lot of absurd things, and I think the money multiplier is also one of these absurd things. So now this was, of course, a very short tour through both models, the classical model and the Keynesian model, but I think you might have realized these models are quite different. And I think something that is also important to note is sometimes when people talk about the classical and the Keynesian model, they say, well, the classical model is for the long term with flexible prices, and the Keynesian model is for the short term with rigid prices. But once you have seen the mechanisms of the financial scheme, this is not something that has to do that has some relation with short term or long term. So if banks can create loans out of nothing in the short term, they can also do it in the long term. And the opposite, if you have the classical model, which assumes that banks need deposits in order to lend, this is a mechanism which prevails in the short term as well as in the long term. And the differences in these two mechanisms are also completely unaffected by the question of whether prices are flexible or rigid. The ability of banks to create loans out of nothing is completely independent of the degree of price rigidities in your economy. So this standard attempt to combine the classical model and the Keynesian model, one for the long term, one for the short term, it is flawed from the very beginning if you really understand these completely different mechanics of the two models. And if you see that these mechanics have nothing to do with short term or long term, or with rigid or flexible prices, then you can see the idea that you can reconcile the two models just by relating it to different time frames, it is absolutely flawed. So, an interesting application of the two models is the way how can they explain the financial crisis. Financial crisis that happened in 2007, 2008, and had its repercussions in the form of a huge recession in 2009. And a wonderful quote is from Queen Elizabeth. She visited the London School of Economics on the 5th November of 2008. And the financial crisis became really manifest on the 15th September 2008 with the crash of Lehman Brothers. And so about, not relatively soon after the crisis became manifest, the Queen went to the London School of Economics, and there were all the professors. She said, if these things were so large, how come everyone missed them? I would say a wonderful question by the Queen. All these famous professors, and there has been a huge tsunami, obviously, destroying a lot of banks and financial institutions in the whole economy. She said, if these things were so large, how come everyone missed them? And what is the answer? Well, I would say the answer is, if you try to understand the financial system with the classical model, which de facto is a model for a commodity economy, a model in which money and the financial system plays no role, it's quite obvious that you cannot understand financial processes. This model is completely blind to the dynamics of financial systems. And so the answer would have been simple, say, oh, Your Majesty, maybe you will not understand it, it's difficult to understand for you, but we, the famous economists in the year 2008, still use a model for the financial sector of a highly advanced economy in which money plays no role, in which banks are more or less passive entities, and that's the explanation. So, and if you just look a little bit at the data and the determinants of the financial system, the classical model, if there's excess of investment, excess of lending, it must have been caused by saving, because saving is the only way how you can obtain, release resources for financing. So one can look at saving rates in the period preceding the financial crisis. And if you look at the saving rates of private households, you can see there was not a major increase in saving rates. Astonishingly, the only country where saving rates increased was Germany, but in Germany there was nothing in terms of financial exaggeration. There were no excess investment. It was just the opposite. Germany, this period 2000-2007 was a very undynamic period, high unemployment, no investment, low investment. So Germany, really nothing happened. And in countries where there was a huge investment, especially in the housing sector, like Spain, United Kingdom, United States, saving has declined. also the same, especially remarkably Spain, where the same rate has gone down. So from the perspective of the classical theory, there was nothing that was indicating any excesses in the financial system. And so I think that's a problem. This model makes economists blind for what's going on in the real economy. So let's go to the monetary model. In the monetary model, the key driver are the banks that can lend without limit to the private households and also to firms. And here, if you look at the data in the years leading to the crisis, there was really there were really obvious excesses. So if you look at bank loans to the private sector in Ireland, they increased by a factor of 5 in just 9 years. This is quite dynamic. And same thing in Greece or Spain, increased by a factor of 4.5. So there was really a lot going on. And this is exactly in line with our monetary model that says, well, in principle, the ability of banks to lend is huge if it's not somehow regulated, and especially if the central bank does not react. So one way how central banks can control or limit the growth of bank loans is by increasing the refinancing rate. They've shown to you. But in this period, the refinancing rate set by the ECB was relatively low. It was only in 2005, 2006, it was gradually increased, but most of the time the ECB did not react at all. So if there's an increase in the demand for loans by speculative agents in the real estate sector, then of course we can have processes where the credit supply increases more or less de facto without limit. And of course you can say, well, if you want to get a bank loan, a mortgage for a house, you need some collateral. But in these years 2000, 2007, house prices increased quite a lot. So the value of the collateral went up, and so there was no problem in providing banks the collateral for bank loans. And so you can see that you can have processes where there's a lot of bank lending, and if the bank lending is used to build houses, to build apartments, what happened in Spain or in Ireland or in the UK or in the United States. So over time, you create a huge excess supply of houses. And in the real estate market, it takes some time until the excess supply becomes manifest on the markets, because it takes time to build the houses and to get the permits to build apartments on new areas. So it takes quite some time until this excess supply becomes manifest. But once it is there, of course, it's a very rigid supply, because you cannot take the houses that are built, the apartments that are built, you cannot take them away. And then, of course, you get a decline, a crash of prices, you get oversupply. And this feeds back to the banking system, because the people who bought an apartment with the intention to get a rent from it, and then with the rent to pay interest and amortization, they do not find the people who want to rent the house. They cannot make the payments to the bank. And of course, this then all feeds back to the banking system, which has a lot of bad loans, the value of collateral declines, and then you have a real. So then we come to the end. What is also important, so if you talk about the flow of funds, the two models, if you remember, in the classical model, there's this one-way flow from savers to investors. And it's interesting, if you describe the flow of funds in the monetary model, the source of the funds are always banks, because funds are bank deposits, and only banks can create bank deposits. There's no other way to create these funds. And interestingly, these funds flow first to the investors. So funds are created by banks, giving funds to investors who want to purchase real assets. So the investors need these funds, and so the funds are created by banks, go to the investors, and then from the investors, they flow to firms and workers in investment industries or to people who are selling existing real assets. So the investors are not at the end of the flow of funds, they are more or less at the beginning. The funds do not stop there. In fact, the funds remain only a logical second with investors. Because if somebody, for instance, if you want to buy a house and you have to pay the house, you try to get the loan just the logical second before you make the payment for the house. And so the guy who buys the house has the funds only for a second on his bank account, and then it's immediately transferred to the person who sells the house. So the investors do not absorb the funds; they're just transmitting the funds to those people who sell the real assets. Real assets can be new real assets, like a machine or a new house, but it can also be existing real assets. Can be a firm that you purchase, or can be an existing house that you purchase. So then the funds are with the sellers of real assets. And the interesting thing is now, these people who sell the real assets, they have now the funds. What can they do with the funds? In one way, they can use the funds, the money that they have been transferred, they can use the money to lend, to buy bonds on the capital market. And that's financing new investors. And I think that's the interesting feature of the monetary model. So that's kind of circular flow. The money doesn't stop with the investors. Instead, the investors are really no kind of intermediary where the money is only for a very short period of time. And then it comes to those who sell the real assets, and those money holders have now the option to lend the money out again on the capital market to new investors. And so there is this kind of circular flow that characterizes the monetary model, which is completely different to the kind of one-directional flow of the classical model. Of course, it's also interesting. So in these monetary models, funds can also be destroyed if the sellers of real assets use the money that they get to repay a loan. Then money can also be destroyed. That's the way how the flow of fund comes to an end in the monetary model if people repay their debt with the bank. So it's quite interesting to compare this circular flow with the one-directional flow of the classical model. And we do not want to go too much of the detail, but the interesting thing is in medicine, for quite a long period of time history, people believe this blood flow is a one-directional flow, a one-way flow. And this goes back to Mr. Galen, who lived in the year 129 to 216 after Christ. And for quite a long time, people believed the blood flow is a one-directional flow coming somewhere from the heart and then somehow dissipating in the arms or the legs. And people believed this for quite a long time. And it took almost 1,500 years when William Harvey realized that blood circulates. And so we can contrast a little bit this with our economic theory, where one part of the economists, or maybe most economists, believe in this classical model with a one-way flow, comparable to Mr. Galen a long time ago, and where it's not a common knowledge to have this kind of circular flow of financial funds in the monetary model, which corresponds to this model of William Harvey. And I hope it will not take 1,500 years until all economists believe in this circular flow and give up the idea of this kind of one-way flow that the classical model postulates. Good. So I think we are now at the end. Maybe we can just compare the most important things. So classical model versus monetary model. Important thing, funds. The classical model is all-purpose good. In the monetary model, it's bank deposits. How are the funds created? They are created by private households that save. The monetary model, they are created by bank loans. What are banks? Banks are just intermediaries of funds. The monetary model, they are originators of funds. The model mechanics, deposit creates loans in the classical model, and saving generates investment, while loans create deposits in the monetary model, and investment generates saving. Sorry about that. The central bank in the classical model has no effect on saving or investment, so it's irrelevant for the real side of the economy. The only thing it can do is it can control a price level, but is irrelevant for the economy, because it's just this kind of veil, but it does not matter for the real things in this economy. In the monetary model, the central bank is a very important, probably the most mighty actor, as we can see right now in the COVID crisis, and we'll discuss this also later on. And it has direct control over the money market rate, and this gives it also a kind of indirect control over bank lending and investment. And the flow of funds is a one-way flow from savers to investors in the classical theory, and in the monetary model, it's a circular flow from banks to investors, and then from investors to firms that produce investment goods or sellers of existing assets, and funds can be reused for lending in the capital market. So far, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it somehow. I hope you also got some idea of these completely different mechanics of the two models, and I hope you also can understand now that these differences are not related to the time horizon, short-term or long-term. I think these mechanics are so fundamental, so that they do not. So if banks can create money and loans out of the blue, they can do it in the short term. They can also do it in the long term, and it also has nothing to do with price flexibility or rigidity. So for all these differences that we have identified, the degree of price rigidity is absolutely irrelevant for these differences. Okay, yes, I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next week. Bye-bye.